This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman. This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you in association with Smart and theillistedboard.com. And it is the fourth, and thank goodness, final episode in the mini-series, which has been the LFP 10th anniversary celebrations. The first dealt with the last decade in fintech, the second with what an LLM is, large language model, the third, what the risks are in LLMs and AI in general to us and society, and this fourth episode, we look forward to the next decade in FS, Fintech and for the LFP. And then on the latter, listen up at the end for exciting news about developments. I'm glad to be joined today by serial entrepreneur Tony Clark, CEO of NextWave, and not just that, but star of LFP 172, the multiple dimensions of the challenges of digital for incumbent FS projects, and former head of London for former brand partners Silicon. Lots of formers there. We will play team tag on this one, with myself focusing on the stalactite, the macro picture, as befits my former incarnation, global head of fixed income, by focusing on the macro, top-down geopolitical and geofinancial angles. Somewhere in the middle, Tony and I will actually talk to each other somewhat, and at which point I shall pass on to Tony, who will do the stalagmite perspective, the bottom-up, as his day job, he's very much bread and butter, right in, I'm mixing my metaphors here, never done that before, bread and butter at the coalface of digital transformation, take your sarnies down the mine. And this will be a very complimentary perspective and hopefully give you listeners the chance to pick and choose as you wish. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good morning, Tony. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Hi, Mike. It's great to be back on the show. Good to see you.
Well, it was feeling even more great to me because after all the hard work of having done 3 episodes, albeit in terms of funny verbs, I haven't actually yet, but I will have by the time it's released, finalised the third one, the LLM's risk. I was really looking forward to talking to a guest, but then having done a bit of mentoring yesterday, actually, for a hedge fund manager who was a macro trader predominantly and only tactical trader on the side, he and I got to talking about the importance of the macro, and I thought as I only wanted to take a few minutes for the macro, 5 minutes at the beginning, I ought to make some notes, and it'd be a great amazement to you and to the audience as a whole that my notes were a little bit more than a minute and a half, but we shall see to that. So anyway, I shot myself in the foot that not only when do we finish I have to start polishing the LLMs and AI risk, but in the meantime I've written too much which will gabble through. Anyway, enough about me, let's talk about me, or actually let's talk about what's going on in the world of Tony Clark at the moment, before we get on to more exciting things like the whole globe and fintech and FS.
Thank you, Mike. And I love the comment about the research, because I think one of the things that you're doing on this show is going really deep into the topics that you cover. So maybe I'll get a word or two in edgeways at the end. But for now, what's going on in my world? Well, I am continuing to grow NextWave Consulting. So that's my primary focus all day, every day. Sometimes feels like it is 7 days a week. And we're building out a differentiated consulting proposition that's really focused on practitioners and solutions. And we're working with lots of financial institutions. So in the fintech space, I'm talking to lots of interesting firms and really modernising enterprises across banking, insurance and the buy-side sector. So super busy. It's an interesting market for everyone at the moment with political economic uncertainty and cost of living and many other macro forces, which I think you're probably going to get onto in a minute. So that's made it a bumpy ride. But we're really excited and proud about what we've built so far, and we see a great opportunity ahead. So that's really what consumes me most of the time, Mike.
When you're not being a sort of professional husband, father, living, and all the other things.
Well, all of that as well, but yeah, it's sort of time slicing. I find I spin a lot of plates.
Indeed. Well, if you want something done, ask a busy man. Yes. Well, just hearing you before I sort of try and rattle through my 5,000 pages on the macro, then It does make me think of the phrase, or was it the book? Dickens, perhaps. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So from one perspective, it really is the best of times from a technology perspective. I mean, I've first played with a computer in the late 1970s, as I may have mentioned before. So, I've seen computers for quite a little bit. And you have this sort of period where not a lot happens. I mean, not a lot happened with computers really from the late 70s through the 80s. Well, actually, maybe early in the 80s you had the BBC Micro. But anyway, you had computers, you had mainframes, and you just sort of used them kind of thing, and that's obviously what banking did. And then you had the sort of personal computer, which you could play games on, your BBC Micro, Play Defender, well, it was a very hard game. But then, of course, you had the internet and all the Y2K and all this sort of excitement and the tech boom, and that was amazing. And then everything sort of calmed down a little bit in the noughties and through the tens. And now we've got, as we'll talk about in the middle, when the stalactite and the stalagmite meet, we've got this amazing explosion in AI, and even an old cynic like me finds it hard to think anything else other than, wow, that's perhaps one of the most awesome things going on ever. So that's the good news. The bad news, maybe I shall get to the bad news now and just quickly rattle through Mike's sketch. It's only a sketch of what the macro is. The macro sets the context for everything else. So in terms of the next 10 years, in fintech, in financial services, well, that rather depends on the world. Some are being very highly relevant to FS, as we'll come on to. So just very briefly to sort of rattle through the big pictures, as I mentioned on the New York specials before, from my perspective, the super macro thing here is the whole sort of Great Reset versus Great Awakening. And I've mentioned before Alexander Dugin's 2021 book, he being a Russian scourge of Western neoliberalism, where the collective is something to be actively destroyed and where nothing is sacred, as he put it. And as I mentioned once or twice before, with great approval, I believe Spengler was right over a century ago in his book, which is more literally translated as The Downfall of the Occident. It certainly seems to be downfalling to me at the moment. Although he didn't foresee the US role in this, or indeed what I see as the US empire, and probably didn't know that the US was going to emerge from World War II owning more than 60% of the world's gold. Don't know how that happened, actually. And one sentence just sort of summarising sort of Dugin's thesis is of great relevance in terms of the multipolar world we're seeing, and very relevant to financial services. This isn't just geopolitical waffle, which seems to summarise the growth and power of what I see as civilization states, namely the likes of China, Russia, Saudi, and many more, have a clear idea of what they are as a nation, what they are as a culture, and what they stand for. And I think this very much is echoed in a sentence from a review on Amazon, which is very relevant to how FS goes the next 10 years, as well as all our lives. The reviewer said, history is, he, i.e. Dugin says, at one of its major turning points, where humanity must now choose between a great reset, a nightmare post-humanist world as advocated by the Western liberal elite, or else a great awakening where the peoples of the world who want to preserve their culture, traditions and humanity will take back power from them. So I think that's my one-sentence macro thing about everything. But then just very briefly, there's lots of open questions here. I had a discussion with a mate of mine who's very dissident-y, a musician, about 15 months ago. Difference of opinion over what globalism was. He said globalism is everyone's in it together and they're all trying to destroy us. And I was sort of coming more from the perspective that if you go to large parts of the world, there is no globalism in, for the sake of argument, Malaysia or Vietnam, and it's much more a phenomena for those people who live in the US, EU. That's an open question because in practice there are no extremes, and for example Russia and China have got no plans to pull out of the United Nations, which still has its Agenda 21. We had the health initiatives of the WHO, which failed. So the line between global and bipolar is still to be drawn, and where it's drawn is unclear and very important, and this will come very relevantly when we talk about the BRICS M-Bridge project, which I find really interesting. Definitely one for the podcast going forwards. And then just very briefly, again, I've talked about it many times, is that from my perspective, the US and the EU, the US imperium and the EU are collapsing sort of financially, legally, culturally, ethnically, probably many other ways. And we're in the most dangerous period for the world since 1939 to perhaps 43 or 44, whenever it was clear the Allies were going to win. And then for my sins, I do follow a little bit too much the Duran YouTube channel I mentioned before, where nuclear war risk is at the highest since the 1960s, to my great shock. I did wear a great coat and a C&D badge in the 70s. I've still got the great coat, I don't know the C&D badges, I should get it out again. And we've got perma-crises and perma-war and climate change and COVID-19 and all this kind of stuff keeps coming in. And again, as we've touched on the podcast before, multipolarity or bipolarity is rising very, very, very strongly. as a result of the US using one time too many trade as a weapon of economic war and the seizure of the Russian bank central assets. Huge growth in BRICS. I've lost track of how many now. I think it's getting on for 100 countries are in BRICS or applying to join BRICS as associate members. And recently with the G7, which back in the day when I was a fund manager was a really important thing for how the economics and interest rates and FX went around the world, had a meeting where they, can't quite remember, slagged off China or something like that, pissed off China. And China retorted by pointing out that the G7 actually only accounts for 10% of the global population and is falling. So that's quite an interesting perspective about what's arising. Getting on to the more relevant to the FS, and we're only going to see this going forwards, and getting on to the fact that it's not really caricatures, but actually it's sort of, there's some subtleties here. As people may or may not know, and to the extent they don't know or not well informed, there needs to be an LFP on this one at some point in time. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank's bank, has been running a program called mBridge for some time, slightly relating to CBDCs. mBridge is a swift alternative, and it's not just that BRICS are doing their own thing. I think BRICS are very careful not to say we're just doing our own thing. They're just setting up an alternative to SWIFT and for settlements, and going back to this being nuanced and not sort of black and white, good and evil, whichever side you happen to fancy. The likes of HSBC and Goldman's have been heavily involved in this project. So again, you've got the tensions between global companies and the sort of more bipolar political stuff. And then just in terms of trying to sort of lead into some of the sort of interesting and good news perspective from a personal level, but also from a FS perspective and how I see it going forwards, is that this whole Great Reset versus Great Awakening angle, as I've said before, is what are you awakening from? You're awakening from a bunch of hypnoses, and there's an extent to which the US empire has been an empire of lies, which I say not to be rude to Americans in the slightest. I've been gifted by some amazing Americans as guests on the show. But really in terms of how the federal state or the deep state or the war machine runs itself, and there's a famous one here which I actually did check was a correct quote, because it is quite an astonishing one, which sticks in my mind, which is that, and I find the actual quote from the person who was at the meeting, which the quote is, as he did to all the other secretaries of their departments and agencies, Reagan asked what he saw as his goal as director of the CIA, to which CIA Director William Casey said, "We all know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." Absolutely astonishing statement, and in passing, as many people know, it's true that roughly every war that America's been involved in, First World War, Second World War, Vietnam, Iraq, Ukraine, etc., the casus belli, the reason for the war, has been exposed as false. Now, just on that, and getting a little bit lower than the macro-political stuff, I didn't follow Twitter too much because I just find it sort of too depressing, and we all have to get on with life rather than focusing on this sort of big picture resettery and awakening. But more recently I've seen some amazing threads on Twitter, which is, I mean, one was on Tiananmen Square, which is phenomenal. I mean, I thought I knew what happened in Tiananmen Square, but of course Mike didn't know. Mike wasn't there. He's read sort of various accounts, and the evidence seems to be completely different, in way more than I'd have bet myself, being an old cynic. Gaddafi's Libya was another one I saw. Tucker Carlson insisting that Nixon was overthrown by the CIA, which astonished me, having actually lived through it at the time and remembered it vaguely, even if I did know that Nixon had beaten Kennedy in the whatever it was 62 election, which my father told me when I was young, because of course he was interested in the assassination, as everybody was. Subsequently being confirmed many times by Ron Paul. So it's really interesting that it's very hard to know what is actually going on, which I'll come back to in terms of the Great Awakening. And in terms of two major things here, which I think have led to all the problems that we're facing, I'm a big fan, as you know, being a listener as well, Tony, of the fact that society is shaped by its technologies as much as, or if perhaps more, than the people shape the technologies. The first one we covered in LFP 220 with Mario Ineco has essentially the Federal Reserve and 50 years off the gold standard directly led to monetary and social disaster, where I think we concluded yes, and there are some very strong precedents here in terms of revolutionary France and Napoleon, and then Weimar Republic, and then Hitler. In terms of debasing the currency, once you debase your currency and make it literally worthless, then you always tend to get massive wars, massive corruption, and that kind of thing. So we're still suffering from the 1972 decision of Nixon to come off the gold standard. And the other one, of course, is technology, as Edward Snowden famously warned us, massively empowering the permanent state, the deep state. So anyway, look, that's all the negative-y stuff, which doesn't sound good, which is one reason I wanted to rattle through it, because it's a lovely sunny day and it's not often sunny. But coming to the green shoots and coming much nearer to financial services. We see this tendency in the US to bipolarity in itself. If the world is splitting into two poles, then also the US is to a large extent splitting into two poles. So, for example, we've got 5 states in the US now, which is 10% of them, now suing Pfizer about the mRNA catastrophe. And also we've got, about a year ago, I saw an article saying that 23 US states have now moved to recognise gold and silver as legal tender and outside taxation. So one possible future is that the US bifurcates, and one of it is sort of Newsom level Californication, and the other goes back to more constitutional stuff, including constitutional money and a much smaller federal state, which I think is an interesting possibility. And going back to Mario Necco, I'm personally grateful to you, Mario, if you're listening, for your nudging me in terms of the direction of buying gold, which is certainly going up. So in summary, I think it's a tricky situation, and I think we've got a rocky road ahead. But in terms of the good news for individuals, I think it is, according to all, quote, spiritual, unquote, sources, by which I mean those people who focus on consciousness rather than the matter end of the spectrum. There is a great awakening going on in terms of people waking up from what I call in LFP 2023. You got a special fling Pater's cave, escaping the matrix in search of love, light and healing. That sounds good. The 3 levels, the metapolitical narratives. I mean, we've got an election at the moment, and compared to, say, 20 years ago or 40 years ago, far fewer percentage of the UK population actually believe what one party says is happening and they're going to do, or another party is happening. So you've got metapolitical awakening. We've got the psychological awakening, which is outside of this one, which takes us further, where we just simply carry on that process and distinguish between our beliefs and the truth. An interesting thing, if you've got sort of kids in their 20s trying to tell them that, well, what they think is the truth might actually be a belief. And then there's minor matters like existential awakening. So that's the big picture, which is that I think there are 2 countervailing forces going on, one of creating order and the other creating chaos, and we're pretty much stuck in the middle of them. But there are some green shoots ahead, and obviously we all know that the US election in the autumn is going to be important. But regardless of who wins elections or what happens, we do have very important projects like Enbridge, and we do have something of a resurrection of gold and silver as currencies. I mean, added to that, bank balance sheets are in bad ways, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to have to see about the overall context, but I suspect that in 5 years' time, if we get back and talk about what did happen in the next 5 years, we're probably going to conclude, this is my view anyway, we're probably going to conclude that actually there was quite a lot at the micro level and the mid level within fintech, but actually at the macro level, it was all about, oh my God, and then America split into 2, or oh my God, it completely collapsed and China invaded, or there was nuclear war and stuff like that. So, yeah, so anyway, so I've rattled through that one by way of context, and that's, I can guarantee to listeners, that's the last time I'm ever going to waffle about the macro. So maybe, Tony, we can actually sort of, me having done my waffle, my very brief waffle, get on to the fintech, because as much as occasionally it slips my mind, it is the central word in the London podcast, and I thought maybe it's a good time to let you have a word in Edgeways. And in particular, you'd mentioned that you'd listened to the LFP 10th anniversary special where I covered the last 10 years in fintech. So maybe just start with the last 10 years in terms of listening to that, what leapt out to you, and also your 10 years in fin and tech, and what's leapt out to you about the past, which a bit like my macro picture will inform the listeners about where you're coming from in terms of how you see it going forwards.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Crikey, there's a lot there. So I love the top-down perspective. And, whilst the last 2 years seem to have been even more macro shocks to the system and unexpected things happening, I'm hopeful maybe there's going to period of more stability ahead of us, but who knows? I mean, gold and silver as legal tender outside taxation, populist politics, the bipolar approach. I mean, we'll just have to see. But the last decade, I think you've done 250 episodes.
Plus, because I forgot to number a whole bunch of them, like all these specials. So I think there's about 260, 270 or something crazy like that, yeah. And
the last special, -1, I think, was a gallop through pretty much all of them. So which I have listened to. So I'm not going to try and reflect on that particularly, and certainly not at an episode level. But I think the last decade, it's a little bit like the evolution of any sort of new tech innovation, or perhaps the iPhone, where there's this new idea and we are going to all be using that. And at a day-to-day, month-to-month level, you don't really notice the change. Then you just sort of wake up and everyone's using it. It's become a part of every aspect of daily life. And if you look across the themes from the last decade, yes, we're all talking about generative AI at the moment, but the evolution of the very many different aspects of fintech and reg tech and insure tech and the things and the automation that's coming in front to back across financial institutions, concepts like embedded banking, the crypto space. We were talking a lot about the metaverse, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and more recently. I'm curious, maybe I'm just not paying attention to that part of the sector, but there's been less noise in that space, and it'd be interesting to see what happens next in the virtual world. But all of these things are encroaching and evolving the industry that we work in. And I think we are approaching some tipping points where some of these things are going mainstream. They're sort of creeping up on us, and they're creeping up on the big institutions, and models are really starting to change for good. I think so a lot of that's happening more quickly than it has done in the past as well. So that the whole sector's sort of accelerating. But there's very many different topics that are sort of part of that movement. And I think you did a great job of covering it over the last few years.
Thank you very much. From a high-level perspective, and it's probably about a month since I did that episode now, many weeks since I did that. My mind's full of LLMs in the meantime, trying to explain spreadsheets without a video, as an example. I think that the last 10 years, I'd say that, well, first thing, which very much is relevant to my view of the next 10 years, is that if you look back, innovative technologies were overhyped in their promise. You've got this whole hype cycle where something's hyped to the sky and then everything's sort of damned to the damnation, and it comes back to this sort of middle point. So one of my sadnesses, not intellectual surprise, was that P2P, well, is it rude to say it's failed? It didn't really replace the banks, which is what some crazy people were saying in the beginning. And as I mentioned in the episode you referenced, I had a very good episode with Zopa talking about the whole 20-year trajectory of it. And Zopa, who invented P2P, don't do it anymore. So that was one. You got the whole digital currencies, bitcoins, and all those kind of things where people could talk for hours about how it's gone and all that kind of thing. But equally, it didn't live up to the original promise that people had. Not least of which, and again, this was completely obvious from the beginning, actually, which I think is relevant to what we should think about the current technologies going forward. You pay for your Starbucks double nutmeg cappuccino latte or whatever, and you're standing there for 5 minutes while the blocks freeze themselves, and it doesn't really work. And not only that, but that wasn't a problematic use case in the first case. Bank cards work really well, tap, done in a few seconds. So that's still something I see that's to a certain extent technology in search of a need. But then we've come on to the Embridge, which is starting to use some of the technology. So everything is a platform going on. So yes, the hyping of technologies and the main hyping of massive innovations, which were really interesting, those are the ones that tend to run out of steam. Whereas what was perhaps less expected and nobody talked about was, in terms of, you mentioned the several hundred guests, there's a hell of a lot of innovation, but a lot of it's quiet on the side. It's in trade finance, or it's over here in tweaking payments a little bit and all that kind of stuff. So it's things that's definitely improved the world and definitely made, in certainly the financial services sector, and made it more efficient and better for consumers. But a lot of it's been relatively quiet and relatively below the radar. So possibly that's just screwed our chance of predicting the next 10 years, because what that implies is that it's a bit like Greek tragedy, actually, that the thing about Greek tragedy, for those people who aren't aware, is that one of the things about Greek tragedy is that right at the beginning of the play, it's obvious that the main character has got a flaw in him. And by the end, he's going to turn around and bite his bum. So the whole thing it's a tragedy because, oh no, this is going to happen. And it ends up happening. So it's a bit like a Greek tragedy. So I think if you were to give me 10 to 1 odds, should we say, on what we might talk about in 5 years' time, then I'd definitely put a few quid on the kind of, quotes, tragedy of generative AI, being the one that I emphasised in great length the episode before last, on the nature of generative AI, which it's not a logic machine, it's not a reasoning machine. It is literally a bunch of weights applied to a calculation, but it's just a computer doing a calculation. And therefore, that generative AI may not make the changes in FS. In fact, I'd be quite happy to bet that it wouldn't make the changes in FS that the median commentator who's hyping it up at the moment says it will, literally, because the fact that it's not being rational and it occasionally gets things completely wrong does rule it out for a hell of a lot of use cases. And you talked about, a number of use cases in FS. But in practice, if you're a person sitting in a bank using a technology, the ratio of false negatives to false positives or whatever can't be too high. If you're, let's just say simplistically, ChatGPT is, watching all your deals, and it comes out with 1 million baddies a day, and your department has got to go through 1 million false baddies, that's not really going to work out. And interestingly, the last time we did one on AI with Tristan Fletcher, whose business Chai is very involved in predicting the copper price and all that, he doesn't use it at all, because if you're trying to predict the price of a metal and you try to hedge metals or insure metals or commodities in general, then you can't have a system that can get it completely wrong. So yeah, so that'd be my bet. I'd sort of say that generative AI use cases aren't going to be as great as we think, but equally, on the other hand, that actually a lot of the quieter stuff will be. So that's my guess for the future before we turn to the more sort of micro stuff. And you, Tony?
Well, let's see. I mean, the machines that make calculations, and much of that output, though, is useful and has now found its way into daily life and into our workflows. So I think, there's certainly a hype cycle around AI, and we're talking in our conversations, our travels around AI and the opportunity for AI and the risks all the time. I think AI and automation is set to dominate. And in fact, there's a nice definition that I've been using a little bit in recent weeks, which is useful AI, which is just AI that actually sits in your workflow and actually does something tangible that improves your output, your efficiency, rather than just being a sort of a widget AI that gives you a little bit of copy. Perhaps for the marketing folks might argue that this is useful anyway, gives you a bit of copy for your latest press release, but something that's really coupled with automation and agency that can get something done. I think there is a bit of a hype cycle, but it does feel different. And when you start to unpack the use cases, most of our clients say, we've started to look, we've looked across the finance division, we've got 60 things we might want to do with generative AI. We're now trying to filter them down, and we're working for a benefits case and time to market and ease of integration, and we're trying to work out which solutions to go with first. And you start to look at some of those things, and they're already sort of a bit out there and probably too much to bite off. But there are lots of other examples which are genuinely useful AI, and there's only one direction of travel, and I think we're going to see an increased application. If you look at the sector, our team have looked at this, and it's been looked at by our clients all the time, and there are literally hundreds of use cases, but we've had conversations around, can I use multi-language AI to do surveillance on the trading desk in multiple languages in real time? Interesting one. Can I loss prediction, of course, for underwriting loans, mortgages, in the bond space, but cards, but could I use the same engine to do that across all the different product types? And if we got that tuned and we got that right, the upside for the business could be significant. What about using advanced analytics and AI insights for regulatory reporting? Well, there's an interesting one there. Good luck talking to the regulator about explaining what happened in the black box of the AI. So I think some of these ideas are going to hit the blocks fairly quickly in terms of explainability and whether or not they're really going to be possible in a regulated process. But there are others which are just augmenting the human advisory experience, perhaps on the buy side in wealth management, which are just speeding up the fact-find process, perhaps, or providing suggestions where you can really see how that's going to make the whole experience for consumer more effective. So I think AI and automation is going to dominate. I'd go as far as to say the narrative in some of our clients is, let's explore this AI thing and what it can do for the business. And while we're doing that, let's not make any too many big investments in sort of the existing technology estate. So we're actually seeing some things going on pause while the opportunity for AI is explored further, which is an interesting idea. I'm not sure how long that can really persist, because a lot of things went on pause sort of post-pandemic economic crisis anyway. So a lot of firms have underinvested in the technology estate and again are looking at the more strategic opportunity perhaps before signing off on big investments. So I'm not sure that's going to persist for too long. But what comes out the other side of it, the audience have read Mo Gawdat, who's the ex Google X Senior, he's written a book about AI wiping out humanity if we don't train it right. I think the storyline is essentially that generative AI is currently a teenager, and if we bring it up correctly, it will respect and look after its parents, and if we don't, it's going to go off the rails and extinguish the human race. So whether or not you subscribe to that narrative or not, this is going to change everything. Will it do to the extent that that some are saying? I doubt it. There's a practical aspect here, which is data foundations. It's all about the data. And when you look across firms who've got these exciting ideas about how they're going to use co-pilots and AI going forward, a lot of the time they just don't have the access or the data foundation to draw on in order to really sort of operationalize the shiny new thing, which is the AI agent.
Yes, well, hopefully for listeners who've listened to the previous episodes of this one, which is the one I haven't quite finished yet, on the risks in AI, they will have concurred with me to sort of totally demolish this sort of sci-fi perspective that sort of ChatGPT is going to suddenly crawl out of your computer and throttle you because that's based on a misunderstanding. I think there's two things. I think the first thing is that I'm very LLM focused, having written about 15,000 words on LLMs recently. And LLMs, generative AI in general, is just a subset of AI as a whole. I don't like AI as a phrase for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of which is what's intelligence anyway. And in terms of the millions of emails I get coming in for people wanting to be on the podcast from their PR people saying, oh, our firm uses artificial intelligence and it's so good, then when I'm having the pod prep call with people, and actually generally in episodes as well, I say, okay, so you're using your computer to do something smart. From a computer science perspective, so-called AI is simply a different way of using your computer rather than doing a line-by-line program that you write each line yourself. It's a different form of computation where you just chuck a bunch of data at some system and it sort of settles down, amazingly enough, as I said a couple of episodes ago, at these weights, which have compressed meaning into these weights. So, yes, that's the kind of category area. I was slightly disappointed to hear you say at the end that you were suspecting that the generative AI wouldn't have been that good because I was quite looking forward to having just a personal bet with you over a bottle of champagne in 5 years. I would say a case of port, which used to be the old school version of this, but as I'm planning to be a digital nomad, actually, which I should have mentioned in passing, just to preface my macro, for those people who didn't listen to the previous episode, due to some aberration in their life, which is that Bridget and I are busy selling up here and are planning to flee abroad as a digital nomad, which may or may not colour my macro view, or vice versa. My macro view, I think it's better to say, actually informs that decision. But yes, so AI as a whole, what does it mean? It means a hell of a lot of things, according to people who email me. And it's always like a magic wand. And to your point about banks trying this, that, and the other, absolutely. And that's why I think it's a really fun time and the best of times in that regard. And we shall see. But yes, I'm sad to say it doesn't sound like I can sort of twist your arm live on air, as it were, into a bottle of champagne where we get together in 5 years' time and we have an honest gentleman's agreement that, actually, it didn't turn out to be that useful, where the fatal flaw was there at the beginning.
Well, look, Mike, I'll take that.
Okay, great.
Take that bet, and when you get back from your field trip, then we can compare notes.
Field trip around the world. Well, yes, if I don't do enough digital nomading, which is one of the challenges of the business model, given that I'm sort of quite happy with the idea of working half a week digital nomad and half a week skiving off.
Yes.
I'm a little bit concerned that sitting on some beach in Da Nang, the sort of the lust for marketing myself and the digital nomading front may sort of subside, and therefore, if you win the bet, Tony, it might actually be a sort of a rather cheaper champagne than it might otherwise be. But maybe we should move on now. So you've talked quite a bit about where it's going in the future. Is there anything more you want to say before we move on and talk about some pretty exciting news in terms of the future of the London FinTech podcast?
I suppose I touched, in line with the theme, very much on AI and automation, and that's going to be a huge part of it, but I think not entirely at the expense of the other things that we've been talking about. So I think we're going to see more of a sort of convergence of technology-enabled change for the sector. So there will be the crypto, the embedded banking, the cloud-enabled services, and very many other things that are all evolving at pace as well.
Right, okay, so before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all you listeners out there, my brand partners for the podcast. Smart is transforming pensions and retirement worldwide. Their leading-edge retirement tech platform propelled them to success in the UK. Now they're operating on 4 continents and working with partners like Zurich and JP Morgan. Find out more at www.smart.co. Enlistedboard.com, your guide to entrepreneurial governance and how you can start making your board an engine of growth today. So, at which point, we normally have a dessert course, which is a flag waving for the guest company, in your case, Next Wave. But in this one, which I've been slightly trailing, and I wonder whether people have put 2 and 2 together and made 4, or asked their ChatGPT what 2 and 2 makes, which is that there is a changing of the guard. So, as listeners will know, and it actually became kind of obvious to me over the last year, because I found myself saying it on podcasts, and it did seem to weigh heavily on my shoulders that it was coming up to the 10th anniversary, and I probably started mentioning this about a year ago, actually. And then it sort of slowly dawned on me as to, okay, well, 10 years is quite a lot. You probably get less of a murder these days, so I've done my time. I've paid my dues to society. And then it was very much on my mind a question of the podcast going forwards. And sometime I think I had a conversation with someone who asked a very good question, which is one I ask in mentoring all the time, which is, okay, if I was your fairy godmother and I can wave a magic wand, what do you want? But in the context of podcasts, and I said, well, I think I've done all I set out to do. I've done this massively long episode guide pages for those that haven't checked it out on the website, londonfintechpodcast.com. We've covered all of the sectors multiple times within fintech. We've covered pretty much everything I can imagine on entrepreneurialism, less on the technology side, and then much against my expectations, it expanded into technology society episodes as well. So that then brought to my mind, well, what would the fairy godmother view be for the podcast? And I did say, can't remember whether I related this conversation to you, I did say to this sort of buddy of mine, I said, well, rosy scenario, you've got somebody fresh with renewed enthusiasm who is a founder. I mean, I founded things myself, but not many things, who's going to produce the next decade with a complementary perspective, or they're coming from a different angle. I've come from sort of very top down, very FS. I mean, I did my macro trading back in the day, so the macro stuff is 35 years ago I was doing macro stuff, and it's hard to drop it as it might be possible for listeners to tell. And then also that once you've done 270, 280 episodes, it's very hard to think of new jokes or new topics. So I think the exciting news is that the podcast is assured of a great and glorious future, and as far as listeners are concerned, we're very much levelling up. They won't have to listen to my bollocks about the macro picture or ray sets or awakening or all that shite, and we may have a future of a podcast where when we were discussing this, Tony, because you're the lucky one who got chosen out, many people were queuing at my front door. It was causing traffic problems in my area of South London or East Surrey, depending on which you believe. But yes, you being the lucky winner of the contest, you have interesting, innovative ideas about taking it forward. Like one of them, which didn't really land, and I didn't quite understand it. You've had to explain to me, which was letting the guests get a word in edgeways. How is that going to work now?
Mike, what can I say? So yes, I'm going to be taking the podcast forward. So, well, first up, I sort of have to acknowledge everything you've done over the last decade. We talked about it briefly, but huge coverage. And you have a sort of intellectual depth and approach to the podcast, which sometimes leads to you talking more than the guest.
Is it?
And for my part, see, I'm just going to bring myself to this. So I'm hoping to ask questions and have very much hope some super engaging conversations with some amazing guests. I probably won't be quoting the Buddha Latin. I might not swear quite as much on the podcast, Mike. So we'll have to see.
Interesting FS point here. I did not use to swear at all, but it was my time being involved with bond dealers. Literally, I just picked up the habit. It hasn't fucking gone yet. Terrible.
There you go. Hard to change habits. But look, genuinely, it's a super tough act to follow. This is about continuation and evolution of the podcast, not radical change. There's an opportunity to spruce the format up a bit, so we're going to move to video. So this is
as well as audio for those who
as well as audio. Yeah. So you'll be able to find this on YouTube, and if we work out how to do it properly, on Spotify for podcasters as well in a video format, but in all the same places in the audio format. And we'll make a few adjustments along the way, but fundamentally it's going to be about getting some great stories from some great guests and trying to provide some insight to the interesting things that are going on in the sector. So, well, Mike, as you know, because we've been talking about this over recent weeks, we're sort of in that transition process currently. I think this conversation is kind of, firing the starting gun in that sense.
Absolutely, and if you can't beat them, join them. So we're transitioning as well, because it seems to be all the rage at the moment. And I think that this evolution is in some ways returning the podcast to its origins. If you take me back 10 years, I would have bet any amount of money that I'm not going to start waffling about Spengler and all that kind of stuff. And to your polite remarks about intellectual, I was reminded when you've said that one of the old squirearchy in the old city families back in the day, a long time back in the day, gave me some good advice. He said, in the city, a good bedside manner goes a long way, otherwise known in American as fake it until you make it. So I'm not sure there's anything behind the challenge. It's just sort of good use of chat GPT. But in terms of returning it to its origins, I mean, you're going to keep the same format in terms of starter, main course, dessert, and emphasising the human being-y stuff.
Yeah, very much so. And I've always learned something from every episode, and I hope to continue that. We've got the first 5 or so guests lined up. I've got CEOs of innovative financial institutions in the wealth sector and the banking sector. I've got one of the founders of one of the most impactful AI businesses that I've seen so far. I think that's going to be super interesting amongst the plethora of AI startups that are out there. We're also going to hear from the legal profession in a good way, I must say. I don't always want to hear from the lawyers, but there's a very interesting legal technology angle and a conversation that I'm looking forward to having there, and folks that are moving and shaking in the broader fintech ecosystem. So really hoping and planning to continue the high quality of guests that you've had on the show. We're going to also emphasise and focus on the human angle, the origin story part of it. I think one of the great things that you've been doing is, I think it's sort of partly in the preamble. You've always found out a bit about the person and where they're coming from and how they got to where they are today. And I think that's actually what makes these conversations interesting. And then together with that, and this is perhaps about sort of fine tuning the conversations as we go forward. Whilst every discussion always starts with a why, and it should, I want to focus a bit on the how. So you've been doing the top down, the macro, the pioneering in the sector, and I think we're very much into a build phase. I see it in the work that we do with our consulting clients, where we're solutioning and we're building things. So whilst it's interesting to understand the influences, the macro influences, it's also, I think, equally interesting to understand how did you do that? How did you build that? Get under the hood a little bit on tools, techniques, and some of the levers that people have pulled to create their firms to pull their initiatives forward. So I think this next decade, perhaps a little bit more about building the enterprise than perhaps the first decade of the LFP.
Yes, exactly, and I think that's the thing that I'm very excited about, and I shall continue listening to them all and only sending you the occasional email saying, I think I prefer the original host. His jokes are very good. I didn't like your jokes so much. But on the other hand, that one email will be outweighed by the people who say, thank God you're talking about fintech again. But in all seriousness, I'm extremely pleased that I'm passing on to you. One of the things that somewhat surprised me, not somewhat, but slightly surprised me over the last 6 months was my desire to look after the London FinTech podcast per se, and I'm really happy to be handing over to somebody who's been a friend for quite some long time now in the city, as well as a former guest, as well as a listener to the show, and as well as an important part of one of the former brand partners. So I think you know and love the podcast as well. And as one of the things that we've discussed was in my Qigong incarnation, where I'm an instructor, not what I instruct, because nobody's interested in this sort of doing things in a boring Chinese way for a long time thing, which is that it's very important to do it in your own way, and I'm sure you will. And one of your great advantages over me is that you are literally pounding the streets of London, in touch with the scene, and certainly over the lockdown years where I just ended up doing podcasts over the computer, staring at pixels. It was very interesting because I was very fortunate to be doing LFP India or LFP China or LFP Saudi Arabia or France or Germany. I found those very interesting, and hopefully listeners did as well. I think the reality is that I'm much further away from any of the coal faces of financial services, which in itself is a kind of a wind that's been blowing me more in the direction of the abstraction. So yes, having got to the sort of 300,000 feet view, or the sort of 30 light years view sometime of fintech from quite some distance, yes, it's very good to get back much nearer the sort of 3,300 feet level, and in particular, as well as the sort of educate and entertain perspectives, I'm sure that you'll do extremely well what I've always been keen to do, which is to find the best people I can find and share the best experience and advice they've got to benefit the community as a whole, not just those people who are interested in it per se, but those people actually working in it. And I've always been very pleased when I've had guests who said, well, actually, I heard this episode and I found that really useful and all that. So to find the best practice that one can and share it with the world is quite an honour. So I'd like to thank you very much for our conversation today, Tony. I'd like to wish you every success in the future. The keys are your son. Don't wrap it round the first tree, you see. And in particular, I'd like to thank the listeners for the loyalty over the years and for not all of you trying to cancel me on iTunes reviews. I stopped reading those many years ago for those people who have. And I should probably end up with a shout out for myself. So if anybody needs a fractional digital nomad, if anybody wants to stop me lying on the beach for too long in Da Nang, then do reach out to me, although actually it's less about that than because I've got about 15 minutes capacity before which I get bored sitting on a beach. Bridget can do it much longer. It's me going back to the hotel room and watching far too many YouTubes on stuff or something like that. Then do reach out. But otherwise, thank you very much, Tony, and to the listeners, so long, and thanks for all the fish.
Mike, thank you, and looking forward to the next wave of the podcast. Very exciting for the podcast. I think very exciting for me at a personal level, and if I can make it even half as insightful as the last decade of the LFP, then I think we're winning. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thanks for listening. If you're in need of a non-executive or advisory director with deep expertise, experience and contacts in the worlds of both traditional FS and Fintech, or unique insight into how to make your board an engine of growth today, contact me at mike@mikeballiman.com. If you just need one-off advice in these areas, via clarity.fm/mikeballiman.
We could sit in a bender all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moonrise, watching a happy moonrise. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 the firelight